Türk Dili ve Tarihi programına hoş geldiniz. Bugün LİAO Nehri Vadisi'nde Türkçenin 9000 yılı konulu Türkçe için çok önemli bir konuyu sizlerle paylaşacağız. Bundan bir yıl kadar önce 10 Kasım 2021'de Profesör Doktor MARTİNE ROBBEETS başkanlığındaki Max Enstitüsü'ne bağlı 300 kadar bilim insanının çalışması ile ortaya bir çalışma çıktı. Bugünkü konumuz bu çalışmanın başındaki Profesör Doktor MARTİNE ROBBEETS'ın bize vereceği bilgilerle bunun ne kadar önemli bir konu olduğunu Türk kamuoyuna mal etmek istiyoruz. Tabii ki bu projenin veya bu sohbetin gerçekleşmesinde en büyük katkıyı Almanya'da doğup büyümüş ve orada üniversite tahsillerini yapmış olan EYÜP TUZKAYA ismindeki genç Türk arkadaşımızın sayesinde bütün bunlar oldu. Almanya doğumlu. Eğitimi 2013-2018 arasında Duisburg Üniversitesi Essen'de siyasal bilimler ve Almanca öğretmenliği okuduktan sonra 2019'da Semerkant, Özbekistan'da Yabancı Diller Üniversitesi'nde bulunuyorlar. Gene 2018-2022 arasında da Ruhr'da, Üniversite Bochum'da uluslararası ilişkilerde master yapıyorlar. 2020'de Hakkuk Üniversitesi Güney Kore'de, orada yabancı diller okumak için bir müddet bulunuyorlar. Toplumsal faaliyetleri de 2020-21 arasında Aktif für Hessen Partisi kurucusu ve müdürlüğü, daha önce ise 2019-2020 arasında Türkiye-Almanya Gençlik Köprüsü de çalışmalarını sürdürüyor, sosyal faaliyetlerini. 2015'ten bugüne kadar da Duisburg Essen Üniversitesi Türk Öğrenciler Derneği'nin kurucusu ve başkanı. Profesör Doktor Martin Roberts ile yaptığımız söyleşi 10 Kasım 2021'de Nature'da yayınlanan makalesi konusundadır. Profesör Doktor Martin Roberts, Belçika'nın Bergen şehrinde doğdu. Akademik kariyerine önce tıp alanında başladı. Daha sonra odağını dil bilimine çevirdi. Japonca ve Korece gibi bilinen Asya dilleri üzerinde çalıştı. Belçika'da dil bilimi konusunda lisans çalışmalarından sonra Hollanda'da master yapıp doktorasını Japonca dili tamamladı. 2015'te Almanya'da Mainz Üniversitesi'nde profesör oldu. 2018'den beri de Mainz Üniversitesi'nde fahri profesör olarak çalışıyor. 2020'de arkeoloji ve lingüistik grubunun lideri olarak Almanya'daki Max Planck Enstitüsü'nde çalışıyor. Şu ana kadar yayınlanmış birçok yayınları var. Özellikle Trans-Avrasya dilleri teorisi ve karşılaştırılmalı Japonca, Korece, Türkçe, Tunguzca ve Manço dillerinde çalışıyor.
But I think she will tell us more about the topics herself in a moment.
Thank you very much for this beautiful introduction, and thank you, of course, also for having invited me.
Sizce dil nedir ve dil bilimsel araştırma bizi hangi konulara, hangi yeni anlayışlara götürür?
Thank you very much for this important question. Yeah, linguistics is the study of language, and we can study the language synchronically, that is at a certain point in time. But we can also study language diachronically, that is the development of language over time. And my specialization lies with diachronic linguistics. That is, I'm a historical comparative linguist. And historical comparative linguists can take you back very far in time, long before the attestation of the first written records. Basically, we compare attested languages to reconstruct ancestral languages. But this ancestral language has never been written down, so we just reconstruct it. And it can be separated for centuries and even millennia from the first written sources. So it is this ancestral language, this proto-language, that we reconstruct. And once that we have reconstructed then the proto-language, we can also have a look at the ancestral vocabulary and try to reconstruct the natural and the cultural environment of these ancestral speakers. So if we find words, say for textile technology or for crops or for certain stone tools or for animal husbandry or dairying, then we can also deduce that the speakers of that language were familiar with these practices and events. And then linguists can also try to find out with whom the ancestral speakers were in contact. We could, for instance, find out that the Proto-Turkic speakers, the ancestral Turkic speakers, were in contact with Old Iranic speakers because there are borrowings, loanwords between two languages. And then linguists can also build language trees, and these language trees visualize how languages broke up and spread over space and over time. And we can also date the nodes in the tree. That is, we can find out at which time the different separations happened. And then finally, linguists can also try to locate the homelands of ancestral language families in space. So we can find out where the ancestral speakers were located. And last but not least, I would say it is also important that linguists cross the boundaries of their own fields, and that we put our linguistic evidence or evidence about the location and the timing and the migratory dynamics of language, that we put that together with findings of archaeology and genetics. Archaeologists and geneticists study also variables like time and location, and they also study the migratory dynamics of people and cultures that form the object of their study. So putting or mapping these different lines of evidence on each other, we can reach a more holistic view on human prehistory than each of these disciplines can provide us with individually.
Dili yeniden inşa etmek nasıl mümkün olabilir?
Yes, reconstructing, I have to, here, reconstructing language, what we really do is we take contemporary forms, or we take attested forms of the language, we compare them to each other, and we try to unwind the similarities, the regular similarities, back to the most recent common ancestor. But if you compare, let's say, languages that are very distant in time, that have separated very distantly in time, like Turkic and Japonic, and you still find similarities, then you can unwind these similarities to a common ancestor that is very deep in time. In our case, that would be like 9,000 years ago. Like, for instance, you have verbs in Japanese kamu, bite, chew, and you have in Old Turkic, for instance, and also other Turkic languages, this word kem, to bite, to chew. You can, comparing this, we can wind that back to a common word for kem in the ancestral language. Or here with katay, hard, solid, you have this word in Turkic katuk or cut also. I think it's here. So you have it in Old Turkic, cut or katuk to be hard. You have it in different contemporary Turkic languages, like in Turkish, but also in Uzbek and Shor and Dolgan. And it's even there in Chuvash, in Western Turkic language, Khıbe. And all these forms reconstruct back to one common ancestral form, cut in Proto-Turkic, that again can be compared to these forms in the other Trans-Eurasian languages. So that's how historical linguists, so to say, unwind regular similarities between languages.
Ortak kelimeleri bulmak için Türkistan'daki, Japonya'daki ve Kore'deki düş dünyadan ayrı, dokunulmamış köyleri mi araştırıyorsunuz?
Yes, well, personally, I cannot do all the work for myself, of course, because you have to imagine there are 59 different Trans-Eurasian languages. So I cannot go on field work for every of these varieties that, as you say, are very intriguing. And then some dialects and language varieties may preserve very ancient words and very useful evidence. But that is left to the field workers. Some people in my team do field work, but also in general, there are linguists who specialize in one particular language and one particular variety, who write word lists and who collect data. And our task then as historical comparative linguists is to put together all these data sets, to compare them and to try to find ancestral words underlying the similarities. But so to say, we built on the shoulders of the field workers, indeed. The work in the field is very important. You could say that I'm an armchair linguist sitting behind my desk, but the tough work is done by all these people going out in the field and describing languages.
Nature dergisindeki son yazınızda Türkçe, Korece, Japonca ve Mançu gibi diller arasındaki ilişkiyi nasıl açıklıyorsunuz? Bize bu çalışma hakkında bilgi verir misiniz?
Yes, that's a very basic and an important question. Indeed, this issue, this Trans-Eurasian issue, is one of the most disputed questions of historical comparative linguistics. So the question whether the Turkic languages belong to the same family as the Japonic languages and Koreanic and Tungusic and Mongolic is one of the most hotly debated issues in linguistics. And we use this term Trans-Eurasian in reference to this large group of geographically adjacent languages, including here Japanese and other Japonic languages in purple. Then we have Koreanic languages, today only Korean in yellow. Then we have the Tungusic languages that are today almost extinguished, but you see these little red spots on the map. Those are Tungusic languages in red. And then we have the Mongolic languages. Here you see in blue the Mongolic languages, not only Khalkha Mongolian as it is spoken in the Republic of Mongolia today, but there are about 15 different Mongolic languages. And then we have this vast group of Turkic languages. So not only Turkish, Turkish as we know it well, and as you probably you are native speakers, but a whole group of closely related languages stretching all across Eurasia, so including even these Turkic languages that are spoken in northern Siberia, like Yakut and Dolgan. And these separate language families are relatively uncontroversial. Nobody would dispute that they are genealogically related to each other. But the question whether all these languages go back to one single common ancestor is one of the most disputed issues in historical comparative linguistics. And even if even when I agree that much of the evidence for this relationship provided in the past is questionable, I still think that there is a small core of evidence that can support the genealogical relatedness of Turkic to Japanese, Korean, Tungusic, and Mongolic languages. So I believe that it is possible to state that Trans-Eurasian is a valid genealogical grouping.
Çalışmalarınızın sonuçları nelerdi?
That's a good question. So, what is the evidence for Trans-Eurasian? That is actually a question that I have been studying over the last 20 years. It has been always at like the center of my career as a linguist. And to show that languages descend from a common origin, we need different pieces of evidence. So first, we need to compare basic words. So not just any words, but basic words, words that are universal across the languages of the world and that are relatively resistant to cultural influence, to borrowing. Words like head, mouth, nose, child, parent, eat, drink, moon, star, like this very basic words. That's the first thing we need, the basic vocabulary. But then we also need to compare sounds. We need to find phonological correspondences, sound correspondences. So the words need to correspond in a regular way. Each sound needs to correspond regularly to another sound. And then finally, we also need the building stones of the words to correspond. So these little morphemes or building stones that make grammatical function or that derive words from each other, they need to correspond as well. So that are the three pillars we need to establish linguistic relatedness. And in the case of Trans-Eurasian, as I already showed to you, we find basic vocabulary. That means that these basic words, like the word for bite, but also what or burn or heart, these basic words are corresponding. And we find about 93 etymologies for basic vocabulary corresponding. In addition, so as I showed, these correspondence sets are well distributed. It's not as if a word is present in only one language, but it's well distributed over the different languages of each family. So not only in Old Turkic, but also in Turkish, in Azerbaijani, in Turkmenian, in Uzbek, in Uyghur, and so on, and even in Chuvar. And then we also find sound correspondences between the different Trans-Eurasian languages. I gave you this example of kata, heart. Here we see that every sound is corresponding regularly. So the K is corresponding regularly, the medial vowel A is corresponding regularly, and the T is corresponding regularly. And those correspondences do not occur only in this word, but they occur again and again in different sets. So like that, we can establish a list of sound correspondences. Consonant correspondences, these are the consonant correspondences for the Trans-Eurasian languages, but also vowel correspondences. So we have vocabulary and we have sound correspondences. And actually, we also find morphology. My previous study that was published in 2015 was a book on the diachrony of verb morphology, showing that there are little elements in the verbs that correspond regularly as well. So for instance, here there's only one example. In Turkic, we have a resultative nominalizer, a little word, that's a little building stone that derives words, nouns from verbs. Like you have, for instance, a verb kus, kusmak, to reduce, and then you would have kızga, short, reduced. And this little ga or ka can be compared to the same element that does the same thing in other Trans-Eurasian languages. So we have morphology, we have phonology, and we have vocabulary. And that is why I believe that Turkic is indeed relatable to Japonic and the other Trans-Eurasian languages.
Bugün konuşulan diller yanında eski yazıları da kullanıyor musunuz?
Yes, indeed, that is very important, as you suggest. So here, this abbreviation OT stands for Old Turkic, and Old Turkic is the language of the Orkan in inscriptions. So the language that has been found in Mongolia's Orkan Valley on the inscriptions of the Khans dating back to the 8th century AD. And the Old Turkic period stretches over Old Uyghur, the Old Turkic in the Tarim Basin, to the language of Mahmud al-Kashgari's Compendium of Turkic Languages, which was written in Karakanide Turkic. So this whole period is called Old Turkic. And we do rely on sources in Old Turkic, and we add these elements to our comparisons.
Örnek olarak Orhun yazıları diğer Japonca veya Korece yazıtlarla karşılaştırıyor musunuz?
Yes, actually there are 5 branches to Trans-Eurasian: Japanese, Korean, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic. And in the basic vocabulary, we found in the 200 basic vocabulary, we found about 150 sound word comparisons. When we go larger, also include cultural vocabulary, there are about 340 etymologies that support Trans-Eurasian relatedness.
Bulunan ortak kelimelerin çoğu kesme, kapma, alma gibi yaptığımız şeylerle mi yoksa daha çok nesnelerle mi ilgili?
Yes, that's very important for linguists. So most of the words relate to basic vocabulary in the basic vocabulary, we find a lot of verbs. So more words for, as you say, grabbing, taking, eating, and so on. More verbs than nouns, than objects. And this is a very important observation, because we see across the languages of the world that nouns are easily borrowed. So objects are easily transferred from one language into another, say from Turkic into Mongolic or from Mongolic into Turkic. But verbs are much more difficult to borrow than nouns, because they are more abstract and because they are inflected. People will not so easily borrow a verb. For instance, if Turkish borrows the verb to click from English, like to click with a computer, it would say something like klik etmek or kliklemek, I don't know. But it would also have to accommodate for this borrowing with a special element, and it's rather rare that verbs are borrowed, and it always goes over nominalized form. And the very fact that we find so many naked verbs shared here is therefore in support of genealogical relatedness rather than borrowing. If this would be a borrowing relationship between the different languages, you would find many, many objects, but not many verbs. And in reality, we find it the other way around, as you suggest, many verbs and just a few nouns.
Çalışmalarınızda bu keşfi LİAO nehrinin yakınında yaptığınızı söylüyorsunuz. Orada ne buldunuz ve neden orada? Sizce neden bu alandaki dillerin ortak bir kaynağı, kökeni var?
Yes. So indeed, when we then accept this Trans-Eurasian relatedness, it brings us to new questions. New questions arise. And as you correctly point out, one of the big questions is, who were these speakers of Proto-Trans-Eurasian? Who were these ancestral speakers to the Turkic speakers? Who were their ancestors? Where did they live and when did they live? And that are questions that cannot be answered with linguistics alone. In order to do that, I needed to integrate other fields like archaeology and genetics into the picture. And to find that out, or to find the location out, we integrated these different techniques. But from the linguistic perspective, we collected a huge database of 98 different Trans-Eurasian languages. We collected etymologies, word comparisons for these languages, both for historical stages like Old Turkic and Old Japanese, but also contemporary languages like Turkish and Uzbek and so on. And we collected basic vocabulary and cultural vocabulary. And on these languages, we applied computational techniques, Bayesian phylogenetics, to find out first a dated tree, a classification of the languages. But these techniques were also used to model the languages in space. So based on this classification, we let the computer, the algorithm, decide where the center of the spread really was. And what we found, converging this computational techniques with more classical techniques of homeland detection, we found that the most likely origin for the 5 different groups was probably situated in northeast China, in the West Liao River area. And the first split into Altaic, which is Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic together, and Japano-Koreanic, happened there. And so Japano-Koreanic went to the Liaodong. And then you see Turkic splitting off very early, I think 6,000 years ago already. Turkic goes into the steppe. Then Koreanic goes to the Korean peninsula, Tungusic to the Russian Far East. And finally, Japonic moves over Korea to Japan. So that was how we modeled this dispersal in space.
Bu haritalarınıza baktığımda Çince nerede? Çinliler o zamanda var mı? Yoksa bu Trans-Avrasya dillerinden olan Proto-Moğol veya Proto-Türkçeden mi daha sonra ayrılıyorlar?
That's a very good and relevant question. Sino-Tibetan is the ancestor of the Sinitic languages, Chinese, and also the Tibetan languages. So the languages also spoken in the Himalayas and so on. They all go back to one common ancestor. And recently, in 2021, there was a study in Nature that suggested and confirmed earlier studies that the ancestor of the Sino-Tibetan languages is probably situated here as a neighbor to Trans-Eurasian in what we call the Yellow River Valley. So a bit to the south of Trans-Eurasian. Linguistically, there are no indications that Sino-Tibetan is related to Trans-Eurasian, but what we find is probably very early ancient borrowings at a very early level. So we think that Sino-Tibetan was situated in the Yellow River area around 8,000 years ago, and that it was therefore contemporaneous and nearly adjacent to the speakers of Trans-Eurasian. So most probably there was some exchange between those speakers, but they don't go back to a common ancestor, at least not one that we can demonstrate. You can never know, of course, but relatable or related in linguistics is relatable. Only what is relatable with the methods can be related.
Professor Roberts, thank you for your knowledge. We learn a lot of things from you. I wish to learn, you are saying Mongolia Japanese, Korean, and Turkish, and other some language was burned same area. But normally one of the origin. Which one is the origin? Because
Moğolca, Japonca, Korece, Türkçe dillerinin aynı bölgede olduğunu söylüyorsunuz. Korece, Japonca ve Moğolca bugün çok küçük bir bölgede konuşulduğundan, Türkçenin ise çok geniş bir alanda yaşadığını, sadece Asya'da, Avrupa'da değil, Afrika bölgelerinde bile bulunduğunu biliyoruz. Hangisi kökendiridir? 9000 yıl öncesini düşünürsek, Türkçenin asıl kök dili olduğunu söylemek mümkün müdür?
We cannot put it like that, but we can say that Turkic has a common origin with Japanese, Korean, Tungusic, and Mongolic. So all these languages are sister languages that go back to a common mother. But we cannot say that Turkic is the mother, Turkic is the sister. And the different languages go back to one common ancestral language. Of course, the reason why the Turkic languages became so spread across Eurasia is something that happened much later, and that is the adoption of pastoralism. So first, the ancestors of the Turkic speakers were probably farmers, millet farmers, but around 1000 BC, so 3000 years ago, pastoralism was important from the western steppe to the eastern steppe. And it is probably there that the Turkic speakers adopted pastoralism, added pastoralism to their agricultural knowledge. And due to pastoralism and horse riding, they were extremely mobile. And from the Bronze Age onwards, they spread all across Eurasia. And that is what caused this picture today, where you find the Turkic languages all spread from Turkey in the west to Yakut in the northeast. So they were extremely mobile.
Çince'de bugün Trans-Avrasya dillerinden ödünç alınmış kelimeler var mı?
Yeah, good question. I'm not a specialist in Chinese, but just recently I hired a doctoral researcher who is, she is Chinese, and she's a specialist in old Chinese reconstruction. And our goal is, as you suggest, to find out whether we can find evidence for very early borrowings between Trans-Eurasian and Sino-Tibetan, but not borrowings that go back to the Bronze Age or later, but really very early ones that are perhaps going back to the beginnings of agriculture and the exchange of agricultural practices.
Kültür bağlamında ortak atalara da bakabilir miyiz?
I don't have a picture of them, but I understand where you're going. You're going into the archaeology and into the culture. I cannot comment on these Baobab specifically. But indeed, one of our goals, the goals of our study, was then not only to compare the languages, but also to compare the culture, the different cultures of the different populations. And that was, of course, a huge challenge for me, because as a linguist, I knew about the timing and the space of the languages and about the migratory dynamics of the languages. But one of the big challenges was, how now can we combine that with findings from genetics and from archaeology? And one of the basic ideas that underlied our research was an independent collection of data and an independent analysis of data. So the archaeologists, like here, or archaeologist Mark Hudson, he went out in the field and collected archaeological data and performed archaeological analysis independent from the geneticist and the linguist. So our geneticist, like here, Ning Chao, went out in the field, collected samples skeletal remains independently from the other ones. And like that, each one collected his data and did his analysis. And only in the final phase, we brought the different lines of evidence together. So, for instance, in the case of archaeology, we scored different features relating to ceramics, to stone tools, to buildings, to plant and animal remains, to shell bones and artifacts, and also to burials. So perhaps the Balbal are somewhere in, but I'm not sure. We had, say, 172 features that we compared across all these different archaeological sites. So we had Neolithic sites and we had Bronze Age sites. And we scored all these sites for the features. And then we applied also these computational techniques to the different cultural features. And basically, what we found confirmed that millet agriculture originated here in the West LİAO River area. So we find the origins of millet agriculture exactly where we find the origins of the Trans-Eurasian languages. And from there, millet agriculture dispersed to Korea 6,500 years ago and to the Russian Far East 5,000 years ago. And then later rice agriculture was integrated and it moved from this Liaodong-Shandong interaction sphere over Korea to Japan, where it caused a big turnover from hunter-gatherers, Jomon people, to Yayoi people, to farmers. And the Turkic people were probably also millet farmers. They lived here, split off, went more here, and then only in the Bronze Age they started to spread all over Eurasia. So in this way, actually, we found that millet was the big archaeological shared component. So where the speakers of Trans-Eurasian share Trans-Eurasian ancestry as a common linguistic component, they all share millet agriculture as a common agricultural component.
Farklı kültür ve etnik kökenlerin yazıları hakkında da araştırma yapıyor musunuz? Kazım Mirşan, Orhun Türkçesi yazıtlarının kökenini hakkında birçok araştırma yaptı. Kırgızistan, Kazakistan, Tamgalısay, Sölgentaş gibi kaya resimleri üzerinde çalışmalar yaptı. Oralarda birçok kaya resmi var. Yani Kazım Mirşan, Orhun alfabesinde gördüğümüz birçok sembolün kökeninin kaya resimlerinden gelme olduğunu söyler. Örnek olarak at sembolü için bir atın resmini görebilirsiniz ama daha sonra bu at harfine dönüştüğünü de görürsünüz. Bu konuda bir araştırma yaptınız mı veya bu konuda ne düşünüyorsunuz?
Personally, I do not make that kind of research, but I think it's extremely interesting, of course, to understand the origins of the script. But as you correctly pointed out, you said you stressed the word symbol. So script is a symbol for spoken language. So many people have spoken language, but they don't have script. So what we try to focus on is attested spoken language and to wind it back to spoken language in prehistory, so to say. So we are not so much.
Yapacağınız yeni dil bilim çalışmaları var mı?
Well, yes, as we discussed, so far we have been searching for commonalities, for similarities, common elements between the different speakers of Trans-Eurasian languages. So we have discussed today that we found this common Trans-Eurasian linguistic ancestry for the Trans-Eurasian populations. We have seen that we find a common component in the archaeology, namely the millet farming. And then our geneticists also found that there was a common component, which is called Amur genetic profile, that is shared by the different speakers of the Trans-Eurasian languages. So far we can say, yes, there's a common component to Trans-Eurasian speaking populations, both genetically, linguistically, and archaeologically. However, what would interest me for the future is to turn our perspective upside down, so to say. So instead of looking at the common component and identifying a common component, we could move away from that and study the differences. Because especially from the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age onwards, we see that all these Trans-Eurasian populations start to spread all across Eurasia. And doing so, they meet non-Trans-Eurasian populations, speakers of other languages with different genes. And this leads to a fascinating picture of mixing genes, genetic admixture. For instance, the Turkic populations go on the steppe. They meet people of West Eurasian ancestries, and we see gradually an admixture of East and Western genetic profiles for the Turkic population. So gradually they mix with Western Eurasian populations. And at the same time that they are going to mix genetically, we also see that their agriculture is complemented with pastoralism. So also culturally, they are going to mix. And we see that their language, that Turkic also has very ancient borrowings relating, for instance, to pastoralism or horses from Iranic and from Tocharian. So this whole picture of mixing genes, mixing subsistence strategies, and mixing language is something which I find really fascinating and which I would like to study in the future. Of course, not only for the Turkic languages on the steppe, but also for Northeast Asia. What you mentioned, this mixing between Sino-Tibetan and Trans-Eurasian populations, is extremely interesting. What happened in the Russian Far East with speakers of Nifk, of Paleo-Siberian languages, and speakers of Trans-Eurasian languages coming on top of that. And then what happened in Korea and Japan with the original Jomon populations, hunter-gatherers, that then are going to mix with incoming farmers. So it is this mix and match that I would like to study in the future.
Bazı Kızılderili dilleri ile Transavrasya dilleri arasındaki bağlantıyı incelediniz mi? Bering Boğazı, Amerikan yerlileri ile Türkler arasında geçiş yeri olabilir mi? Maya dili ile Türk dili arasında da birçok ortak kelime var. Ama coğrafi olarak birbirlerinden o kadar uzaktalar ki aralarındaki bağlantı nedir?
I think first of all that you're very well informed. The thing is that not so much in the vocabulary, in the words, but certainly in the language structure, people have suggested linguistic relations across the Bering Strait. We have, for instance, one researcher, Edward Vajda, who has found that the Ket language, a Paleo-Siberian language from Central Asia, is probably related to the Nadene and Yeniseian languages spoken on the West Pacific coast in the Americas. So there are certainly relations there. The only problem is that these relations go back deep in time, 10,000 years ago and deeper. And with our classical linguistic methods, so studying words and morphemes, as you suggest, we cannot go back deeper in time than 10,000 years ago. So there we are a bit on the limit of what classical linguists can do. However, there are also linguists like Joanna Nichols and Balthazar Bickel, for instance. who try not to look at words, but look at structural features of language, like yes-no features of language. Does the language has a verb in the end or not? Is the language polysynthetic or not? That kind of features they study. And from there, they also suggest what you say, this linguistic relationship across the Bering Strait, which goes back 10,000 years ago and earlier. But that is not so much my field. I'm a classical historical linguist, and therefore I must focus on everything what is before 10,000 years ago.
Profesör Roberts, Kazım Birşan'ın kitaplarını size göndermek istiyorum. Kitaplarından bazıları Almanca, bazıları İngilizce olarak yazılmıştır. Sonraki zamanlarda bu kitapları siz okuduktan sonra sizinle tekrar konuşmak istiyorum. Çünkü kitaplarda çok ilginç fikirler göreceksiniz. Konuşmanız için teşekkür ederiz. Bize çok bilgi verdiniz. Türkiye'ye araştırma yapmak için gelirseniz, araştırmalarınız için Göbeklitepe gibi pek çok ilgi çekici yer göreceksiniz. Yani vaktiniz varsa sizi Türkiye'ye önümüzdeki dönemde bekliyoruz.
You will see a lot of interesting because you know the Göbeklitepe or other some special place very old times more than 10,000 years ago. If you have a time, we are waiting you in Turkey.
Thank you very much for your stimulating suggestions and for your advice, Professor. I must say I take your offer and I will certainly come to Turkey. So, reportaj çok teşekkürler.
Biz teşekkür ediyoruz. Çok teşekkür ederim.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much for this interesting and stimulating talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Biz teşekkür ediyoruz.
Bye.
Bye. Nice day.
Türk Dili ve Tarihi programında bugün Türk dilimiz için çok önemli bir sohbetimiz oldu. Biraz önce de izlediğiniz gibi Macplant Enstitüsü de Arkeoloji ve Dil Bilim bölümlerinin başkanı olan Profesör Doktor Martine Roberts geçen yıl 10 Kasım 2021'de Nature dergisinde yayınlanan araştırması ile Türk dilinin ne kadar gerilere gittiği konusunda çok önemli bir çalışmayı bize açıkladılar. Dolayısıyla bu konunun biz de bu programda geniş olarak size bilgilerini vermeye çalıştık. Her ne kadar sonun esnasında size altyazı olarak konuşması verilse de bu kısımda o altyazıda Martine Roberts'ın tüm tercümesini size soru ve cevabı olarak tekrar burada vermek istiyorum. Çünkü biliyorum ki bizim programlarımızı özellikle genç Türkler dünyanın neresinde olurlarsa olsun çok sayıda izleyicisi var ve bu bir yerde bilgilendirme şeklindeki bir programlarda yazılı olan metinleri YouTube'da durdurup indirerek bunları yazılı olarak elde edebiliyorlar. İşte ben de şu anda size bir yandan bu kapanış konuşmasını yaparken Martine Roberts'ın sorulara verdiği cevapları veriyorum. Özetlemek icap ederse Dil Bilim Arkeoloji Araştırma Grubu'nun lideri olan Almanya'daki Macplant İnsan Tarihi ve Bilimi Enstitüsü'nden Nature dergisinde 10 Kasım 2021'de yayınlanan çalışmanın başkanı, karşılaştırmalı dil bilimci Profesör Doktor Martine Roberts'tan ayrıntılarıyla dinlediğimiz bu araştırmanın sonucunu şu şekilde özetleyebiliriz. Türkçe, Japonca, Korece, Tunguzca, Moğolca'nın dahil olduğu dil ailesinin kökenlerinin dil bilimsel, genetik ve arkeolojik kanıtlara göre yaklaşık 9000 yıl önce bugünkü Kore'nin doğusundaki LİAO Nehri Vadisi'nde Neolitik darı çiftlikleri tarafından kullanıldığı belirlendi. Bu çiftliklerin alt dillerini binlerce yıl boyunca kuzeye, batıya, Sibirya'ya, doğudaki Kore Yarımadası'na ve deniz üzerinden de Japon takım adalarına yayıldığı bu çalışmada belirlendi. Dil bilim, genetik ve arkeolojik kanıtların birleştirilmesi ile 8000 kilometre kareden fazla alanda kullanılan Trans-Avrasya dillerini konuşan kişilerin genetik ataları da belgelendi. Asya coğrafyasında 12.000 yıl önce sona eren buzul devrinin ardından insanlığın darı tarımı ile avcı toplayıcıların tarımsal bir yaşam tarzını benimsemesinin büyük dil ailelerinin yayıldığını gösterdi. Trans-Avrasya coğrafyasında 98 dil var. Bunların başında Türkçe, Korece, Japonca, Avrupa ve Anadolu dilleri, Orta Asya ve Sibirya bölgelerinde kullanılan çeşitli Türk dilleri, Orta ve Kuzeydoğu Asya'da Moğolca dahil olmak üzere çok çeşitli Moğol dilleri, Mançurca ve Sibirya'da çeşitli Tonguz dilleri bulunuyor. Bizim dışımızda yapılan bu çok değerli çalışmaların Türk gençlerine örnek olması dileğimle bu çalışmaları sizin bilgilerinize sunuyoruz. EYÜP TUZKAYA Bey'in konferansın veya bu çalışmanın olması konusundaki gayretini ilk başta söylemiştim. Hocanın İngilizce yapmış olduğu bu konuşmaları kelime kelime tercüme edip tamamen tam bir tercümesini sağlayan o gün Özbayacı Bey'e de burada teşekkür ediyorum. Bu kanalın izleyicileri şunları çok iyi biliyordur ki daha önce de Anatolia Kalyasov profesör doktor, Rusya'da yetişmiş, Dil Bilimler Akademisi üyesi olmuş ama daha sonra da Amerika'ya yerleşip evlenip gene orada da Dil Bilimler Akademisi üyesi olan çok ünlü bir genetikçi. Onun da araştırmalarını, genetik temelli olan araştırmalarını daha önceki programlarımızda sizlere aktarmaya çalışmış idik. İşte aslen Rusya'dan ama şimdi Amerika'da bulunan Anatoli'den sonra 2021'de de tanımış olduğumuz MARTİNE Roberts başkanlığındaki Macmillan Enstitüsü gene özde Türk dilinin ne kadar eski, yaygın ve Türkistan bölgesinin yani Asya'nın büyük çoğunluğunun kadim dili olduğunu gösteren çalışmalar. Tabii gönül istiyordu ki bu çalışmaların içerisinde bizim Türk araştırmacılarımız, akademisyenlerimiz de olsun. Zaten bu gayretlerimiz bunun için. Evet, bugün bu konuda birazcık eksiğimiz var ama önümüzdeki yıllarda bu programların da faydası ile birçok Türk gencinin bu işlerde görev alacağını ve gönül vereceğini bu işlere biliyorum ve inanıyorum. Çünkü biliyorsunuz hep bu programlarda vurguladık. Dil milletin ana omurgası, bel kemiği. O olmazsa millet yok. Türkçe olmazsa Türk milleti yok. Türkiye yok. Türk vatanı yok. Onu Profesör Oktar Sinanoğlu'yla geçmiş 20 senede mümkün olduğu kadar anlatmaya çalıştık. Ama netice işte büyük şehirlerimizin ana caddelerine çıktığınız zaman kendinizi Türkiye dışındaki herhangi bir ülkede zannediyorsunuz. Bazı şehirlerimizde İngilizce hakim ama bazı bölgelerde de şu anda maalesef ve maalesef Arapça yazılı levhalar hakim olmaya başladı. Dolayısıyla bu yanlışlıklardan kurtulup milletimizin ana bel kemiği olan Türkçe üzerine yapılan bu çalışmaları çok çok önemli bulduğumuz için bu şekilde size ulaştırmaya ve bunlardan haberi olmayan arkadaşların haberlerinin olmasını sağlamaya çalışıyorum. Bu gibi faaliyetlerimiz bundan sonra da devam edecek ve belki önümüzdeki dönemde bu araştırmaları yapan MARTİNE Roberts'la Türkiye'de de buluşup biraz önce izlediğiniz Kazım Mirşan'ın çalışmalarından kendisine bahsetmiş idim, ilgilendi. O çalışmalar kendisine ulaştı. Ben de o çalışmalarla yapılmakta olan araştırmaların birleştirilmesinden büyük bir sinerjinin ortaya çıkacağı inancındayım. Tabii ki gönül isterdi ki bu araştırmalar bugünlerde Kazım Mirşan hayatta olsaydı ve bu çalışmalara bizzat dahil olabilseydi. Ama işte 96 yıllık ömrü bu kadar ancak yetti. Ama onun bıraktığı eserlerin veya çalışmaların ne kadar önemli olduğu önümüzdeki günlerde çok daha iyi anlaşılacaktır. Ve inanıyorum ki onun ortaya koyduğu tezler birer birer doğrulanmaktadır. Burada ben bir şey daha itiraf edeyim. Hocayla beraber olduğumuz yıllarda bana Türkçenin esas ön çalışmalarının veya kadim çalışmalarının okyanus kıyılarındaki bölgelerde olduğunu söylediği zaman hocama inanamıyordum. Çünkü o şekilde yapılmış Türkiye'de en ufak bir yayın veya bilgi yok idi. Ama MARTİNE Roberts'ın işte Kore kıyılarındaki bu ağırlıklı çalışması, LİAO Nehri'deki çalışmalarını izlediğimiz zaman hocanın ne kadar haklı olduğunu bir defa daha anlamış oldum. Türk dili ve tarihi programları bu şekilde nefesimizin yettiği kadar çalışmalarına devam edecek. Sizden istediğimiz bir tek bu çalışmaların diğer haberdar olmayan Türk insanlarına ulaştırılmasını sağlamakınız. Hepinize iyi günler diliyorum. Saygılarımla.